Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the J Heritage's program tonight with author Stacy Schiff. I'm Kevin Peraino. I'm the executive director of the J Heritage Center. And if you haven't been before, please come visit us. We're a beautiful 23-acre estate on the shore of Long Island Sound in Rye, New York. It was once the boyhood home of John Jay, and these days we're an education center. We do programs in history, social justice, environmental stewardship, and a lot of other things. And we do quite a few programs like this with great writers and thinkers. And you can find out more about those on our website. And the best way to keep track of what's going on at JHC is to sign up for our newsletter, which we send out a couple of times a month, and keep track of what's going on. Our guest tonight is a terrific writer, Stacy Schiff, Pulitzer Prize winning author. She's a lyrical cinematic writer. I mean, really, truly one of our age's literary superstars. She's the author of 6 books. Her first book about Antoine Saint-Exupéry was a finalist for the Pulitzer. Her second book about Vera Nabokov won the Pulitzer. She's written about Ben Franklin. Her book, her biography of Cleopatra, I saw the other day, it sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million copies, which is like Prince Harry territory or Michelle Obama, unheard of in serious nonfiction. She's written a book called The Witches about the Salem witch trials. And her most recent book, which we're going to be talking about tonight, is called The Revolutionary, about the founding father, Sam Adams. Stacy, thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm delighted to join you, Kevin. Thanks for doing this.
So Stacy and I will talk for maybe 30 minutes, and you know by now how these things go. We'll talk for 30 minutes, and about halfway through, we'll take your questions, but you don't have to wait until the halfway point. You can type your questions at any time in the little bubble that says Q&A at the bottom, and then we will get to them when we get to them. So Stacy, and our guy John Jay and Samuel Adams are they're in some sense they're thought of as polar opposites. Samuel Adams, you think of as this incendiary figure. Jay is thought of often as a reluctant revolutionary, as one of his biographers has said, but they share this thing in common, which is they're overshadowed by other founding fathers. And why, so maybe I'll just start by asking, in Samuel Adams' case in particular, why has he been overlooked for so long?
I should just say in terms of differentiating the two of them, they're really a generation apart. Samuel Adams is old enough to be Jay's father, really. So that's part of the, why we have the handoff in a funny way from the revolutionary generation to the generation that comes later. Adams, to a large extent, dismisses himself from the history. He's an extremely modest man. His cousin John, at several junctures, will suggest that Adams not leave the history to others, that if he's worried about his place in history, Samuel Adams either collect his papers or write his own version of what has happened. And Adams never does that. Part of his reasoning, well, he was always more comfortable in the shadows, pushes everyone else to the spotlight, is very much a team player. Obviously, for the most important years here, it was important for responsibility to be diffused among a number of people because it was sedition after all. And so there was really a sort of no fingerprints school of work at the school of revolution at work here. So a lot of it is, the lingering in the shadows and the not being able to claim responsibility, as well as just this diffidence about his character. But in addition to that, there is I think a sort of cleaning up that takes place after the war, where you want the revolution to be sanitized. You want it to be rinsed of all of the provocations and the street theater and the backs and the forths. And that's really those years of agitation are in large part the work of Samuel Adams. And I think when you rinse the revolution of that more sort of anarchic element, when you rinse away the Boston Massacre and you replace the Boston Massacre oration with the 4th of July, you rinse away Samuel Adams. So I think he's lost from the picture as well for that reason. He does destroy some of his papers in an attempt to protect, obviously, his Confederates. And so he also, to a large extent, destroys the paper trail from which we can construct his life.
Right. If we have any image of Samuel Adams, it's either from the picture on the beer bottle, which probably isn't accurate, or the Copley portrait. But what did he look like? I mean, paint a little picture of who he was and what his persona was like.
The Copley portrait, I think, is quite accurate. I think it's actually it's sort of an off-putting painting, but I think it's accurate. We know that he's of middle stature. He has a kind of barrel chest. He's probably sort of 5'8" or 5'9", of medium build. John Adams describes a later visit after the war when George Washington comes to Boston, and Washington, this monumental Virginian, has on either side of him these kind of portly New Englanders, John Adams on one side and Samuel on the other. So we know that's very much his build. He has piercing blue eyes. He presumably was a fair-haired youth, although we obviously have no images of him as a younger man. There are many references to the fact that he has a palsy in his hands, and that palsy grows worse over the years. It's obviously exacerbated by age and by stress, but it gives him almost a kind of visionary aura. There's something about him. His speaking voice is very sonorous, and his affect is very striking. And so when he does speak, which he doesn't do all that often, interestingly, he commands a great deal of authority. And the firebrand image is also interesting in that that's, I think, our shorthand always for Samuel Adams was, the firebrand of the Revolution. But if you look at what his contemporaries have to say about him, and in particular what John says about him, it's always this man of great decorousness, of great affability, a little formal in his manner, very prudent, very disciplined. John Adams calls him a man of exquisite humanity and genteel erudition. So there's always this emphasis in a funny way on the softness of his character. He knew when prudence was called for and when delicacy was in order.
Tell us a little bit more about his background and upbringing. I saw in your book, his mother gave birth 12 times. What was his early life like, and how did that shape him?
So he grows up in a beautiful home overlooking the harbor. And I think it's not, I think it's important to remember that because it's something that gets forgotten about him later. Grows up amid luxury. He has the best education colonial Massachusetts, or for that matter, the colonies had to offer. He goes to Boston Latin, and then he will go on to Harvard, and where he'll get 2 degrees, in fact. But in the course of his time at Harvard, the family is ruined by an act of British legislation. His father had briefly been the director of a land bank, which had attempted to solve the New England currency crisis. There was a shortage of hard currency in the colonies. And as a director of that bank, Adams's father is targeted by this act of parliament, which essentially destroys the bank, shuts the bank down, and holds its directors liable jointly and severally for all of the debts of the bank. So when Adams is a young man trying to find his footing in the world, getting his master's degree at Harvard, his family's fortune suddenly evaporates out from under them. And, obviously, I think it's hard to draw a straight line there, but I think we can draw a perforated line anyway between his later activities and his feelings about parliamentary overreach from that episode. But in any case, he's then required, obviously, to figure out a way to make a living. And it's something at which he seems sort of splendidly unsuited. He takes a long time to find his way. And that first act is a really sort of a study in failures. He works very briefly in an accounting firm which is run by a friend of his father's, from which he's fired because, as his boss makes clear, he's a very capable young man, but he could only think about politics. So he doesn't last terribly long in the accounting firm. He's horrendous in any case, in any kind of ledgers. He squanders what remains of the fortune. He runs a small business on his own at one point, which he runs into the ground. Has a very vexed tenure as a Boston tax collector, which is a position he seems to have taken in order to support his young family, and which he botches completely. And then really with the opposition to the Sugar and Stamp Acts comes to the fore as a political player. So those early years are really kind of a study in failure, which I find very endearing for whatever reason. So. Yeah,
and I love the line you say. You say at one point, never in his life would he make a wise financial decision. That's pretty harsh. I mean, that's pretty definitive.
I mean, the interesting thing is that he's without profession. He is a full-time politician, which is something that didn't exist in the colonies at the time. And he is assumed by people in power, by the Massachusetts elite, to be a disappointed, kind of a desperado of some kind, to be a man of disappointed ambition. And that is the reason for his revolutionary activities, or for his opposition efforts in any case. But no one seems to remember that he actually comes from great wealth and a fine education, and that he actually is, for the most part, acting out of idealism here.
Mm. I want to remind people who joined us just a couple of minutes late that Stacy and I will be talking for 35 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And you can do that. You don't have to wait till halfway through. You can just type it in the bubble at the bottom. And then when we get to halfway through, we will take some questions. John Jay is often considered the founder of counterintelligence. And you say in the book also, Samuel Adams should have his own plaque in the CIA. How did Adams work in that kind of capacity as a spy master of some kind?
In the first place, he's a tremendous recruiter of talent. So from early in the 1760s and beginning with John Adams and John Hancock and Josiah Quincy, he's really the person who's looking to see who the splendid Harvard graduates are and which ones of them can be included in the opposition effort. And John Hancock is a particular catch for Adams because John Hancock, whose ideas are not necessarily as strong, as firm as our Adams's, has a tremendous fortune at his disposal. And so Adams figures that John Hancock will be very pleased by the attention that a political career will bring him, and that his fortune will be of great use to the cause. And in fact, it's possibly Hancock who is underwriting Adams and his family for many of these years when Adams is really living on handouts from friends. So he's got this group of Confederates, I guess one would say, but he's always able to kind of run an end run around either the lieutenant governor or the governor or the customs official, whoever seems to be doing something which seems to be objectionable at the time. He's always able to sort of create a loophole and then dive through that loophole in some fairly covert way. And some of this we can chart from things, from writings that he leaves. A great deal of it we know from what the yelping Crown officers say about him afterwards. You know, that nuisance Adams is at it again. And if we could only eliminate this one Machiavelli of chaos, as one of them calls him, we could just do away with this opposition effort we could nip it in the bud.
You mentioned before too that he was circumspect about the breadcrumbs that he leaves, and how that makes your life difficult as a biographer. I mean, how rich is the documentary record about Adams?
I guess the best example of that, Kevin, is the pseudonyms. Adams, over these years, from the early 1760s, really almost up to 1776, is writing regularly, assiduously, often very eloquently for the papers, particularly the Boston Gazette and the Boston Evening Post. And with the help of other people who've been down this road before, I can track some 30 pseudonyms under which he's writing. So there's a lot of material. Some of it overlaps. He's often writing with two different kinds of voices or to different ends about different predicaments. But there's a lot of him on the page because of that pseudonymous output. And we do have quite a bit of not only his correspondence, but the letters to him, which are in the New York Public Library. But the other thing, which, as I say, is such a wealth of material, is all of this paper that went back to London describing Adams's efforts to bring the people of Massachusetts into the political process, to, in some ways, undermine the efforts of imperial authority, to in some ways join the colonies together. Every time he makes this kind of an attempt, you hear the squawking of the Crown officials who are involved, who write about it in vivid detail. So even where Adams doesn't necessarily claim credit for those revolutionary acts or for those opposition efforts, we can read about it in papers which are now either in the parliamentary archives or in the national archives in Great Britain.
Right, but what must also have made it difficult as a biographer is he was a master of disinformation as well. He would lie, he would embroider, he would spin.
There are a lot of things that made it difficult, and you just reminded me of what was for me the sort of holy grail, which is his grandson. His grandson had begun a life of Samuel Adams, and when the papers, which Adams did leave behind, arrived at the New York Public Library, they somehow failed to arrive with a diary that is mentioned by the grandson, written by Adams's daughter. And I assumed when I started the project that I would essentially be able to recreate his home life. All the domestic detail would be in those pages, which have failed to turn up. So there was a missing piece already there. But yes, because he's often behind the scenes, there can often be a shadowy trace. I mean, to the question, who organized the Boston Tea Party. I don't think we will ever have a sufficiently clear answer, although it is clear from both eyewitness accounts in the room during the meetings that week, from other hints we have in Adams's correspondence, and from what the few people who go back to London are deposed by Crown officials there had to say, that Adams is a prime mover during that week.
You point out in the book that as a marker of independence, a symbol of independence, July 4th came only later, but that for a long time, March 5th, the date of the Boston Massacre, was a more meaningful date. Can you talk a little bit about the Boston Massacre and how Adams' role in that?
Let me talk about it backwards, because it's the creation of that kind of occasion that was one of Adams's sort of one of his best, one of his sort of trademark initiatives in a way. After the Boston Massacre, he realizes that this is a moment that should not be forgotten, that this assault, as he sees it, this massacre, which is a bit of an overstatement given the circumstances, is something that needs to be memorialized every year. And to commemorate it, he and friends arranged for an annual oration, for which someone very eloquent, usually very popular, is chosen. The pews are packed, the address is published afterwards, and it's always a very sort of lurid and mawkish speech. And it's then, of course, read throughout the colonies. So it's this way of just advertising, reminding the people of this moment when, redcoats cut down innocent civilians in cold blood, because he's not going to let that go. And yes, the March 5th date and the March 5th sort of theater will be replaced later by the 4th of July. But to go back to your question about the massacre, troops arrived in Massachusetts, in Boston in 1768. And they arrived largely because of a series of threats and disturbances. There have been Stamp Act riots. There have been all kinds of attacks on customs commissioners' homes. And the royal governor is not feeling very secure. So regiments are dispatched to Boston. And Adams will do everything in his power, to your point about misinformation, to advertise the conflicts between those troops which are quartered in Boston and the population. And in many ways, in most cases, he does appear to be inventing collisions between the two. So with friends, he starts a sort of syndicate or a kind of news service where every possible case of a civilian soldier clash is written up and then dispatched to New York and Philadelphia and published in those cities and then in those towns, and then finally makes its way back to Boston, where it's republished. And by then, of course, no one in Boston remembers whether this incident even happened or never happened. So, and none of these seems to show up in any of the legal cases, in any kind of court cases. So they do seem largely to be fabrications, but they help to raise the temperature, to raise the sense of indignity of this peaceful town that has been suddenly occupied by troops who are themselves a little restive because they're really not there for any reason and they don't really know why they're there. So there is a great deal of ill will. And Adams does everything he can, obviously, to churn that ill will into something worse. And then, lo and behold, on March 5th, 1770, after a series of provocations, 8 soldiers fire into a crowd of Bostonians who are jeering at them and taunting them. And there are immediately 5 casualties. And
his Confederates also, I mean, you read about Paul Revere's famous engraving of the massacre and how that really shaped not only public perceptions, but it shaped witness testimonies.
I don't think it would have been possible to unthink that art, because it's so, first of all, it's so striking. It's so wonderfully done. Obviously, it's completely skewed. There's, all the action on that one side of that engraving, if you have any memory of it in your mind, is with the troops. The civilians are doing nothing. They're just huddled together as if they're completely vulnerable. They're not throwing snowballs or ice shards or any of the things that we know they were throwing at the troops. The troops had been, just everything about the engraving has been embroidered upon by Revere, to the point where he has a gun. He's inserted a gun into the customs house, which was something on which Adams insisted because he wanted to involve the customs officials in this misadventure as well, largely a fabrication as it was. But that whole sense of how to market this, getting the first accounts of what had happened on that fateful evening back to London, that's Adams at the helm there, trying very much to bring the trials on as quickly as possible when tempers were still flaring, trying to discredit anyone who had any testimony against the civilians. That's really Adams. He barges at one point into a courtroom with a number of friends to try to convince one of the judges that the trials must be held immediately. And he's countered at each of those junctures by Thomas Hutchinson, who's then desperately trying to postpone the trials as long as possible until the town has kind of put itself back together again and can face this with some impartiality.
Let me ask you for a minute to step back to the present for a second. We'll get back to Samuel Adams. You wrote and ask you a little bit about contemporary politics. You signed a letter in 2021, right after the January 6th riots, saying, calling for President Trump's impeachment. And you can't read this book, I think, without being a little struck by some of the scenes of violence. These rabble rousers throwing oyster shells and bricks at troops, sacking the colonial governor's house. And so I just wanted to ask, how, are there any ways in which these rabble rousers of today share, are there similarities that they share, and how are they different with the colonial era revolutionaries?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that putting Adams back into the picture, I think, reminds us is that this was a protest movement. This is, one of the greatest campaigns of civil resistance ever, and certainly the seminal one in American history. But what I think one should not lose sight of, and something on which Adams himself insisted, was these people are throwing off a government that they feel is arbitrarily imposed on them and in which they do not feel they participate. And you see this after Shays' Rebellion in the 1780s, where Adams draws a very clear line between a group of farmers who rise up against taxes, who rise up against the government in which they participate. And Adams basically believes there is recourse that is available to them. That's called an election, and that is a democratic norm, and that is how you voice your opposition to a government in which you actually play a role and have a voice. And he feels basically that those perpetrators should hang because they are upsetting a legally seated, legitimate government. So there's a real sense here that to have a villainous leader imposed on you was a misfortune, but to elect him yourself was a disgrace. I mean, there's really a sense here that democratic norms needed to be at all times respected.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a little bit about Samuel Adams and religion. You write that a kind of Puritanism suffused his worldview in some ways, and you wrote about also in the Witches, the flip side of this Puritan ethos is a kind of intolerance that's almost kind of baked into the cake of American nationalism. How did that play out in the Revolutionary era?
You can see that almost from the founding of America, right? That gritty sense. I mean, these are a protesting people who feel very strongly about their beliefs, but there is also a deep-seated sense of community and of egalitarianism built into Puritanism, and that just seeps completely into, I think, the political thought of the time. With Adams, because he is a man of tremendous piety, you very often see religious imagery in his writing. You see it actually throughout much of the Revolutionary era. It's by no means unique to him, but you do get a sense that he has basically just transferred these ideas of a sort of a community, of a non-hierarchical communitarian religion to the political sphere. And one of the interesting things after the destruction of the tea in the harbor, when you see the Massachusetts towns writing to Boston, most of them applauding what Boston has just done to this noxious tea, the religious imagery is constant across the board. Everyone is throwing off chains. Everyone is invoking the same biblical imagery in terms of delivering us from oppressors, delivering us from Egyptian taskmasters. It really almost seems as if it's a religious movement at that moment.
I'm going to open it up for questions in about 5 minutes. I did want to ask you before I do to flesh out some of the other characters in the book a little bit. It's a biography of Samuel Adams, but there's a number of characters that kind of they kind of come to the forefront. One is Thomas Hutchinson. Can you tell us a little bit about him? He's kind of Adams' chief antagonist.
He's really kind of the anti-hero of the book, and I think it's so deeply compelling. And it's almost, I feel my heart is with Thomas Hutchinson.
You feel sorry for him a little bit,
Not feel sorry for this man whose house is destroyed. So they are both of them fifth generation sons of Massachusetts. They have very much the same backgrounds. They have identical educations. In fact, Hutchinson is a little bit older. And by the time Adams has come, by the early 1760s, by the time the Sugar and Stamp Acts are on the table, Thomas Hutchinson has accumulated a sort of bouquet of titles. He's tall, he's graceful, he's dignified, he's from a very wealthy family. He's married to another wealthy family. He's part of this very elite circle of privileged families, which for various reasons rubs Adams the wrong way. And he is a dutiful and decent-minded public servant who feels that when the Stamp Act legislation is first on the radar, that it is a terrible misstep on the part of London, and who in fact himself will say this is taxation without representation. But he, of course, is not in a position to be able to object very vociferously because he is lieutenant governor at this moment. So they are indeed each other's nemesis, I guess one would say. Hutchinson will always look at Adams. Hutchinson rises to power over the course of these years, accumulating more and more titles. Hutchinson will look at Adams, as I said, as a sort of disappointed man who's never going to amount to anything. At one point, he says, for John Adams, I had expectations, but for Samuel Adams, I never thought that this man would come to any good. And Adams always looks at Hutchinson as a representation of what he most dislikes, of a sort of inbred aristocracy, of this kind of political elite who seem to have their fingers on all the levers of power, and Adams will make of Hutchinson really the kind of face of tyranny. I mean, he becomes, John Adams and Samuel Adams say when they first meet, which interestingly isn't until the early 1760s, that they both of them agree that there is no greater threat to American liberty than Thomas Hutchinson. So they're not even looking at London; they're looking at the representative of the crown in Boston in the form of Thomas Hutchinson, because he does seem to have accumulated so much power. And in fact, when the tea is shipped to Boston, and tea merchants are named, tea consignees are named who themselves be allowed to sell East India tea. There are 6 individuals. 2 of them are Thomas Hutchinson's relatives, 2 of them his sons, and 2 of them his friends. So Adams had a point there, but there is this outsized contempt for and anger at Thomas Hutchinson, not just on the part of the Adams men, but on the part of many of their friends. Also, James Otis, Mercy Otis Warren, that entire circle found Hutchinson's just grasp of power to be utterly frustrating.
Another figure that Adams considered an elitist was something of a frenemy, John Hancock. Talk a little bit about the relationship between Adams and Hancock.
It's an on again, off again relationship. As I said, Adams recruits John Hancock. John Hancock's political beliefs don't seem to have been particularly defined. Hancock was a man of immense fortune, who was very much given to frivolity and to all of the trappings of wealth, lived in a magnificent home, had kept a magnificent carriage, dressed magnificently, and enjoyed being munificent. In fact, he's extremely generous with the town of Boston, with friends, with families of friends, probably with Samuel Adams himself. But the 2 of them seem to rub each other the wrong way at various junctures. I mean, we have letters which are Adams writing to Hancock saying, if you're going to make a career of politics, you have to develop something of a thick skin. You have to understand that people will say not necessarily the nicest things about you, and so he definitely serves as a mentor in some way. But we also know that at other junctures, John Hancock will essentially say he never wants to speak to Samuel Adams again and never intends to. So they fall out, they make up again, and they fall out. Thomas Hutchinson at one point, after the Boston Massacre, when the town goes very quiet and the opposition effort falters, in fact, Thomas Hutchinson will do everything he can to separate Hancock from Adams forever. And he thinks he's succeeded. And then after a certain amount of time, friends will try to put the relationship back together again. And they will travel, in fact, they will be together the night that Paul Revere rides out to warn the countryside that Adams and Hancock are about to be arrested. And so they travel together to Philadelphia for the first Continental Congress, but they don't ever really seem to get along perfectly from that point on. Hancock finds the Adams men generally fairly arrogant. They seem to be working around him to some extent. And in the end, Hancock will come back to Boston, and after the Revolution, really be largely responsible for tarnishing the reputation of Samuel Adams. Will claim all kinds of fictitious things about his activities, which will add to the answer to your question of how we have come to forget Samuel Adams so completely.
And was it Hancock who had the oil painting of Samuel Adams in his house at one point, or is that somebody that was?
No,
okay,
that's right.
So he comes a long way in the course of.
I mean, my guess is that, and this is a supposition on my part, my guess is that Hancock probably paid for that portrait. Adams certainly was not in a position to have commissioned a portrait of himself. And we should say that what that portrait is meant to, or seems to evoke, is the moment in which Samuel Adams stands up to Thomas Hutchinson the morning after the Boston Massacre and makes two calls, in fact, on Thomas Hutchinson to demand that the troops be evacuated from Boston. And it is Adams in a moment of glory, because here he is standing up to the crown, insisting that if the troops are not immediately evacuated, the town there will be blood in the streets, is essentially what he's telling Thomas Hutchinson. So it's Adams with the Massachusetts Charter and with the town instructions in his hands, standing ramrod straight up to royal authority.
Okay, we have some good questions in, so I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to get to audience questions. Adams was a delegate to the Continental Congress. I assume he met John Jay there as well, but he's away. You forget he's away for the better part of 6 years away from home. I mean, what impact did that and his revolutionary activity in general have on his family?
I think the being away also explains how he falls out of the picture later. He really loses touch to a large extent with what's happening in Boston. In terms of the domestic life, I should say that Adams's second wife, to whom he's married during these years that he's in Philadelphia, is an immensely resourceful woman who seems to quail at nothing. She's very much of the Abigail Adams school. Cannon fire in the distance does not in any way seem to bother her. At one point, she writes to Adams, but she doesn't have a pen. She's in Massachusetts. He's at the Continental Congress, and so she takes a pair of scissors and dips the points of the scissors in ink, and she writes him this beautiful letter apologizing for her terrible handwriting, which of course is perfect. So very much a resourceful equal. And in fact, Adams will be mocked for the fact that he talks to his wife and writes to his wife about politics. They see eye to eye. She shares his dislike of Thomas Hutchinson. As he says, I don't understand why a man can't speak to his wife about ideas if he would like to. It's very much an equal partner. He leaves her at various junctures when he's in Philadelphia without money, and she seems to have supported the family through manual labor, which I do believe is a first among congressional wives.
Mm. My favorite member of the Adams family is the family Newfoundland, who was trained to bite redcoats. Fantastic.
That was the kind of detail for which I hoped that I would have more from the missing diary. Exactly.
Okay, we have some good questions. I'm gonna open it up here. We have a question from Brian Huford. He said, "What was Sam Adams' views of abolition and the slavery issue?" Good question.
It's a great question. So in the 1760s, there is an attempt to write legislation shutting down the slave trade, abolishing the slave trade in Massachusetts. And Adams is involved in that legislation, which obviously does not succeed. Also, in the earlier years, on the eve of his second marriage, the couple is offered as a wedding present a slave by Adams's former mother-in-law. And Adams, again, draws a red line here. He balks at the idea. He's very grateful for the gift, but says that if Surrey, as this woman was named, it was going to come to live with the family, she had to come as a free woman, and arranges for her to be emancipated. And in fact, Surrey lives with them for years. And I don't think there's a letter from Philadelphia in which he fails to ask after her. He insists on these attempts. There are numerous attempts to shut down the slave trade in Massachusetts. The last we hear from him on the subject I think, is when the Constitution comes to Massachusetts to be ratified. And he's very hesitant. It's very unclear as to whether he's going to sign the document or not. And one of his objections is that it does not include a clause abolishing the slave trade.
Was he consistent on that? One of the things you find with founding fathers sometimes, including John Jay, is sometimes you say one thing and do another. But did he practice what he preached all the time?
I would say utterly consistent. There are a number of times when I say various towns were writing Boston, when you were hearing from the other towns in Boston about Boston's attempts to counter British legislation. And the towns would write in support of what Boston was doing or disagreeing with Boston's efforts, because for the early years, Boston is more radical than the countryside, and that obviously reverses itself later. And every once in a while, there's a sort of poignant letter, an elegant letter from one of the towns saying, but all of this talk about freedom and all of this talk about throwing off shackles, has it not occurred to you that there are people here who are keeping slaves? Is that not some kind of hypocrisy? And that's actually, when spoken of in those terms, that's not something that Adams, to my best of my knowledge, ever addresses, that there is this inconsistency in the language of what the colonists are demanding and what they are actually practicing. But he himself says that slavery is a repellent practice and distances himself from it as much as possible.
We have another question from Forliano, who asks, are there other figures in other revolutions in France, Russia, China, and other countries in modern times who Sam Adams can be compared to?
I'm sure there are. I'm not sure any name comes immediately to mind. It would have to be someone who combined the team building talents of Adams, because he's immensely good, as I said, not just at recruiting, but in feeding this team and keeping everyone on the same page. Someone with immense discipline, because a lot of what he's doing in these years, interestingly, is asking for people to be patient, asking for people to wait for the right moment to speak out, for the right moment to act, uniting people, because there's a tremendous need here for everyone to be on the same page, for all of the towns to be on the same page, for all of New England to be on the same page, and ultimately for all of the colonies to be on the same page, and for that effort to involve not just the men of New England, but also the women and the children. And so, for example, boycott efforts or non-importation efforts, Adams always made sure that women were very carefully folded into the process, because, of course, if they rejected if they rejected luxuries, if they rejected tea, it was much easier to make this effort work. If they were willing to sew clothing at home, to spin wool at home, then you weren't importing from London. And these were years, obviously, with tremendous restrictions on what you could do commercially in the colonies. So it would have to be someone who united all of those things with also a taste for the kind of backroom bending of ears and wrestling and arm wrestling that Adams was so very good at. So I'm not sure who fits that description precisely.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee who says, of all the people you could write about in this time in history, what drew you to write about Samuel Adams?
It was a couple of things that came together, and I'm not sure exactly of the order. After I had spent 5 or 6 years in Salem, Massachusetts, or 1692 Salem anyway, I felt very much that I wanted to write about someone who stood in the light in some way. I felt it had been very dark in Salem, and I wanted someone who had stood for reason. And Adams had made a cameo in a book I had written years ago on Ben Franklin. And I was struck by the fact that I had kind of walked him on stage and then walked him off stage, but knew relatively little about him, which sent me back to reading what his contemporaries had to say. And I was struck when I did so at how little, again, we thought of him as a firebrand, how differently he was described by his contemporaries, and how to a man, every one of them points to him as the prime mover, the chief antagonist, the father of the revolution, the earliest, the most active, the most persevering of the patriots, as Thomas Jefferson will call him, the apostle of liberty, as Jefferson also calls him. How everyone says that in those 12 or 15 years, what John Adams calls the revolution that precedes the revolution in thinking that precedes the revolution in fighting, Samuel Adams was the critical character. And by that point, of course, I was asking myself, well, how is it possible that, what do the founding fathers know that we don't? How is it possible that he's gone missing from the picture if he loomed so large at that point? Because at that point, it was George Washington and Samuel Adams who were the central figures. And we've, of course, moved on quite a bit from there. So in short, those were sort of the different roads that took me down to the Adams letters. And once I started reading them, I was kind of sunk.
Let me go back for a minute to the Continental Congress and to some of the policies that he was pushing for. His Confederation was his big thing. That was something that he talked about a lot. And yet he distrusted federalism. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that dynamic.
Sure. I mean, from the start, and we should have said this probably, independence isn't on the table for years and years. And I think it's John Jay who says that in 1775, he never heard the word independence mentioned. None of the founders, Ben Franklin says he never, sober or not, had anyone ever mentioned a rupture with Great Britain within his earshot. Obviously, it's a word from which people shied, and it would have been a dangerous word to say aloud. But for many, many years, the question really isn't a rupture with the mother country, a separation with from the mother country. The question is really one of redress in some way. How can we walk back this idea? How can we give the colonies the kind of sovereignty that they feel is their right? And Adams from the start is intent on binding the colonies together in that effort. And really unity is from the beginning. He's reaching out to Rhode Islanders. He's reaching out to South Carolinians to say, we need to stand together. We need to broadcast what we feel are the rights of the colonies. And we need to stand together when we feel that they are impinged upon, whoever is the subject of that impingement. So that's really where he comes from in terms of the opposition effort. But he doesn't mean to entirely sacrifice, I think, New England's dominance in some way, or the New England mentality in some way. And some of that, I think, does come out of his religious feeling. He's very ecumenically minded when he gets to Philadelphia. He's the first person to, he suggests that an Anglican minister open the first Congress with a prayer. And he does that as an ecumenical gesture to his colleagues who he knows fear the hot-headed fanatics from New England. But in the end, I think he's worried about giving up too much authority to a central government. And he just is not willing to sign on. He doesn't see how this federation is going to work, and worries that New England, about which he feels a certain amount of chauvinism, I think, how that's going to fit into the American future.
It's funny too, because it's funny because he talks also about, there's this sort of contradictory thing where he talks about the elitism of Hancock, or worries about the elitism of Hancock. And yet he's sort of, in a way, he's kind of a club man. There's all these, I wrote them down, all the names. He's a member of the Long Room Club, the Monday Night Club, the North End Club. I mean, he's kind of a networker too. How do you reconcile those two aspects of his personality?
Yeah, I'm not sure that can be reconciled, except to say that every male Bostonian seemed to belong to clubs. It seemed to be, as John Adams said, you could be at a club every night of the week. There were so many clubs. It was the kind of social structure of the time. And Adams is clearly using some of those smoky back rooms to bring people into the fold, to propagate ideas, to find new partners in all of his efforts. And that's why I say a lot of him is left in these kind of shadowy back rooms, because that's obviously where a lot of the negotiating went on.
We have a question from Libby Del Greco. It's a long question. I'm going to read it, but a good one. She's asking about your writing process. She says, I'm curious about Stacy's writing process. For example, when she writes about Cleopatra and then switches to Samuel Adams, does she fully clean the slate, clear her process, clear her mind, and start blank? Or is it inevitable that things she concluded about Cleopatra will color and inform her study of the next subject? Any examples?
Wow, what an interesting question. So I'm not sure about, yes, in terms of the clearing of space, there's a physical clearing of space in that when I finish a book, or when I'm finished with the subject of a book, that those papers I cart those papers out of my office. And it's almost as if that's making a kind of mental space for the next project. And I should add, I haven't yet done that with Samuel Adams because I just can't seem to let him go for whatever reason. So I haven't yet got to that sort of purging process with him. I do think that what you take from one project to the next is not are sort of the forms of your research and the forms of your thinking. And I guess the best parallel I can think of here is that Cleopatra's, first of all, is a story for which we have no archive whatsoever. We're working largely from accounts of her enemies. We're working from accounts left to us by Roman men who are writing, all of them, about a Greek woman. So these are, for the most part, accounts which are hostile to her. And we're having to read those accounts. We're having to remember who left us those accounts and whom those people were writing for in order to read them correctly. And that was the only way we can recreate a life of Cleopatra, in fact. So when you come to someone like Adams, where there is a faulty record and where there are whole chapters of which we really have very little to go on, like the destruction of the tea, you are forcibly, again, reading him from his enemies. And again, needing to know who those detractors were, whom they're writing to, what their politics are, why they're casting Adams in the light they're casting him in it, and whether that's valid in some ways. But you're reading them always with a grain of salt, because you know that they are by definition hostile to him. So there's a certain bit, I guess, of the technique I get, which is a carryover possibly from one book to the next. I did feel, and this partly answers your earlier question about where this book came from, that having written about Ben Franklin, I written about Franklin in France in the 1770s and 80s, and having written about the Salem witch trials, there was this kind of question mark in my mind. How did we get from benighted 17th century Massachusetts to the Enlightenment figures of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson? Because so many of the strains that lead to the rupture with Great Britain are actually clear in the 17th century. You can see how there's already a corroded aspect to the relationship. There's already been a royal governor who, in fact, has been deposed by 1692. So this was a little bit the missing piece, missing link between those two books. And so in that sense, there was a certain spillover, I guess, from the previous book, from the witchcraft book.
It's always tricky looking at history through the lens of the present. But I wonder are there other aspects of working on this book that have contemporary relevance, things that tell us something about the present?
Sure. I mean, I think we too live in a very dislocated time, or at least a time that feels to many of us as if there's enormous transition going on. Just as an aside, in 1765, there's a Boston hardware store owner named Harbottle Dorr who begins to keep a collection of newspapers from which I worked closely for this book. And it's because he senses that there's something in the air. John Adams says the same thing. 1765 was the most momentous year of my life, he says at the end of it. There's a sense that the world is in transition. And I think for whatever we're living through, I think we have that same sense today. And the explosion of media, I think, is very consonant between Adams's years and now. And obviously he's using that media in new ways, as with the newspaper syndicate that I mentioned. The way he will establish these committees of correspondence, which is another one of his sort of greatest achievements, which essentially wire the colonies for rebellion. And they function as a sort of pre-modern Twitter in a way, in the sense that the language is very consistent. They are very much in close communication with each other, and they make communication so much faster than it had otherwise been. And I think probably the most glaring, most obvious parallel is probably in that thing that Adams refers to as the odious, what does he say? The odious hereditary distinction of families. That sense that there is a group, there is a 1%, and it has its hands on all the power, and that is a sort of an aristocratic faction which he despises and which he feels very frustrated by. And I think many of us feel that way today, right? That there is an elite who are untouchable in some respect, but who are in some ways making decisions for the rest of us.
And one of the details that stood out also, and this is, I guess, a way in which this time was not so similar to today, is at Harvard, when Samuel Adams was there, your class rank was determined partly by your family's social status. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. By your father's social status, in fact. So that, and again, this I think upends our expectations. When Samuel Adams is at Harvard, he's I think 5th or 6th in his class. because his father had been a justice of the peace, whereas John Adams, who I think we think of as the more distinguished character, was far lower because his father was essentially a country farmer. But yes, your class rank determined where you slept and where you sat, where you took your meals, where you stood in processions. Everyone was very much aware of rank. It was a very hierarchical. I mean, I think we tend to forget that certainly Boston in these years, and New England generally, was a very hierarchical place, and you were very well aware of your place within that world.
You mentioned before that Samuel Adams was one of the oldest founding fathers. I think Franklin was older, I guess. But how did those generational differences play out among the founders?
I'm not really sure that there's an overarching theory there, but you can see even when John Adams, who's just over a decade younger than Samuel, first meets his cousin, he's starry-eyed. I mean, there's a real sense here of who the leaders of the pack had been, who the early adopters, so to speak, had been. And Thomas Jefferson has that for Samuel Adams. Thomas Jefferson will always look to Samuel Adams as someone who's, as he said, whose ideas had been tested in the crucible of time and had come out pure, someone who had been one of the earliest advocates for American rights, and who had seen something that no one else had yet entirely visualized. And he writes to him always as if he's writing to the oracle in some way. He writes to him with tremendous respect and with a sense that he's always approaching his elder. So you see it, I think, most distinctly in the Jefferson-Adams relationship, especially because those two are politically very close in their ideas. And there's a beautiful letter with which I close the book of Thomas Jefferson's at the end of at his first inauguration, when he essentially writes to Samuel Adams and says, "I hope you heard that inaugural address as what it was, which was a personal letter of mine to you. Because I was trying to channel your thinking. I was trying to channel your early Republican sentiments," because he felt that Adams had most purely articulated those ideas. And so he's really looking at him as an originator of these things.
You write, or you've said somewhere, that one of the things that you really admired about Samuel Adams is that he couldn't be bought. Did the British try to buy him?
Such a great question. There's at least one effort. There seem to have been several. His family leave accounts of an effort to early on give him some kind of position to just basically call him off so that he will step down and put his days as a nuisance behind him. The way it comes down to us is that an officer comes to meet with him, having been dispatched from New York to try to pay him off, and Adams essentially sends him off exactly as we would expect him to, with great indignation, and says, I can't be bought. That was the time-honored way certainly it was a way that Hutchinson himself used some of Adams's friends to quash some of the opposition, was to just give someone a nice sinecure, to give them a very comfortable office. John Adams's hatred of Thomas Hutchinson predates this, but later he will be furious with Hutchinson because Hutchinson will manage to basically suborn two of John Adams's closest friends in such a way. And he sees that as just further evidence of the corruption of this administration.
Let me ask about beer, because I think it's 6:53, and I think we're entitled to ask about it at this point. I mean, there was some connection to brew. The family business had some relation to brewing, right? Is that right?
Yes, the family had been for generations maltsters, which is to say that they prepared the malt for beer. And it's an interesting question how his father managed to amass as much of a fortune as he did in a very apparently a particularly difficult and detail oriented business. But it's, yes, to prepare the malt from the grain with which beer is brewed, but they were not themselves brewers.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes.
But yes, that is Sam Adams you see on the bottle, is all I was going to say.
It is. Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left. So if you do have a question, please ask it now, because we try to keep these tightly to an hour. There's a feature, Stacy, that I'm sure you've been featured in it before. I love it. It's in the Times Book Review. It's called By the Book, where they ask writers what's on their nightstand now. So I wanted to ask you, what's it? Obviously you do a lot of reading. What's on your nightstand right now?
Among our matching bookshelves. So I tend to read fiction, which is actually what's behind me when I'm left to my own devices. And more than a couple of years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, I stumbled upon a novel by a British writer named Lyssa Evans called Crooked Heart. And it's just sort of Dickensian tale of this young boy and a woman whom he meets through an unusual set of circumstances in London during the Blitz. And a few weeks ago, I somehow discovered that she had written a sequel to this charming book called V for Victory. And so that is what I'm reading at this moment. And I would say that on the nightstand is a pile of fiction, everything from kind of John Banville to the new Elizabeth Strout. I tend to read novels and memoirs for the most part. And that's, I suppose, because I'm reading nonfiction during the day. So it's always a little bit of a holiday to be able to bury myself in a book of fiction.
Right. Okay. Any other nonfiction that you're reading now? Other guests that we should have this year? Great historians?
Gosh, I'm going to have to send you a full list. I don't want to name names because I'm going to forget to name someone and that will offend someone. But it's been such a great year for both fiction and for both general nonfiction and for biography. Jennifer Holmes's biography of Balanchine I thought was utterly brilliant. It's been a tremendously good year for biography. That's the first one that jumps to mind.
And this book, I should say, also has been named one of the Times's best books of the year, and is on many other bestseller lists. What are you writing now? Do you have? Can you say what you're up to now?
I'm actually I think I'm writing something, oddly enough, about the Crucible, because in the same way that Longfellow makes off with Paul Revere's Ride, and I think has completely contorted our sense of Paul Revere's Ride, which I just realized we didn't even talk about. The Crucible has come to stand in, I think, for the Salem witch trials. It has really made off with the story. And I think most of us in high school either acted in or read the Crucible or parts of the Crucible. And obviously it's fiction, and yet a fiction to which has completely replaced fact. So I'm sort of toying with the idea of writing something about our reactions to and the enduring interest in the Crucible, which is performed throughout the world and often at times of sort of deep political oppression. So it's, it serves its purpose very admirably. It's not a play that was an immediate hit. It's a play that became much more of a hit later when it grows into allegory. So that's what I've been sort of toying with. And I need at some point fairly soon, I think, to move Mr. Adams out of my office and start a new book, but I haven't got there yet.
Not yet. Let me ask about the witches too. What most surprised you when you were doing that research? I think you said that one thing was that there were men that were also accused of witchcraft during the period. Do I remember that right?
Right. There were 14 women hang and 5 men. And yes, it's not necessarily the suspects it's not all sort of marginal characters who are accused, nor is it all marginal characters who will hang. But at the head of the demonic conspiracy, but the satanic conspiracy that is thought to take place that year, is a Harvard-educated minister who hangs. And I hadn't expected to, he's written off by the girls who are doing the accusing as a dreadful wizard. And I hadn't expected to find a dreadful wizard at the center of this so-called conspiracy. And when you talk about sort of hierarchical New England, that was another instance of it, where you had someone who was thought to be kind of the chief of the witches, the wizard who was running this sort of satanic ring. And not surprisingly, that was a man, not a woman. And in this case, a minister as well. And he seems to have been someone against whom there was tremendous animus on the parts of the clergymen who were essentially advising the judges at this point. Cotton Mather will write about George Burroughs without ever naming him. He'll just use his initials. It's almost as if there's something so distasteful about George Burroughs that Cotton Mather doesn't even want to put his name on the page. And it's a mystery that will never resolve, obviously. But yes, I think we always assume that the witches in Salem burned, and obviously they hang, and it's not all marginal characters who are caught up in the trials by any stretch.
There's such a diversity of theme and topic in the books that you've written, and you won the Pulitzer for a book about Vera Nabokov. What drew you to that topic? I think
at that point I wanted to see if you could write a book. It was really the idea of writing a book about a marriage. Here were two people who were inextricable one from the other. And she wrote all of his letters. She types almost all of his pages. All of his books are, with one exception, are dedicated to her. So you have and she went to class with him every day when he taught at Cornell. So you have two people who are absolutely joined at the hip, and about whom, in her case, no one would write about her, because she was the keeper of the archives at the time when biographers came to call. But was it possible to use her as a means of writing about the two of them? How had they constructed this kind of dual identity, which was the monument, which people referred to as VN? They basically together themselves had created this kind of untouchable monument of a living author. And so it was a real question of, can you write about the marriage? Can you somehow show more of him by writing about her? And of what does marriage consist? I mean, it was a really interesting, it was a particularly obviously creative partnership, and a very rare one in the sense that it went on for so many years and in the service of genius.
It is 7 o'clock, and we do try to be strict with our rule of keeping these tightly to an hour. The book again is The Revolutionary by Samuel Adams, or about Samuel Adams. Stacy Schiff, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I want to let people know as well, we have a couple of great programs coming up. We have a program in person on March 19th with the Tufts professor, Carrie Greenidge, who's writing about she's going to be talking about her book, The Grimkeys, which was on the cover of the Times Book Review. It's supposed to be a terrific book. And we have another program on March 26th with the MacArthur genius opera composer Matthew Aucoin. That's going to be a terrific program too. The registration links are already up. If you want to find out more about those programs and others that we're doing this year, you can go to our website. And thank you again, Stacy, and thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you all, and thanks, Kevin, to you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.